Hello everyone, welcome back to Life Point Cap OT90 Challenge. And this is Pastor Chan. And I pray and hope that your days are going well in the Lord. Reading Old Testament is challenging. But then reading Old Testament in 90 days is very, very difficult. And then the next two books that we'll be reading will take it to another level. So I want to encourage you, don't be discouraged and tell you beforehand what's coming up next. The reason why it's tougher because you will notice right away from reading First Chronicles or First and Second Chronicles that you will think in your mind and say, you know what, wait, I just read this. It's like very similar or maybe even essentially the same as the first and second books of Kings. I don't want to read this, and you get discouraged and you stop reading. Now, the books that we're going into are First and Second Chronicles, and they are essentially different than First and Second Kings. The reason why is because they are written with totally different perspective as the author was writing it. So First and Second Kings were written before the fall of Israel and Judah, and we call that pre-exilic books. Okay, so First and Second Kings, the author was looking into and going into the failures of nations as they were about to fall and go into the exile. First and Second Chronicles, as a contrast, is written after the exile, and we call that post-exilic books. So even when the nation of Judah was in exile, and after they came back to Jerusalem and they were allowed to come back to Jerusalem, First and Second Chronicles are written. So if you look in the Hebrew Bible, the Chronicles, the book of Chronicles, come at the end, noting us that it was written much later time than the actual happenings of First Kings and Second Kings or Israel and Judah. So the author is looking back at the history, the same period that the kings were written, looking back in the hindsight, and even in our lives, when we look back into our lives, in our hindsight, we see more of God's grace and hope and how God's grace was with us. So same thing is happening. We're looking back into the history of Israel and Judah. The author is looking for the hope and God's plan of restoration in the book of Chronicles. And as we do that, as the author does that, naturally, the author focuses on the nation of Judah. So God's plan of hope and grace and restoration is embedded in the Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles. So same duration, but then totally different perspective. Same kings, but then different perspective. So those two books focus on spiritual qualities rather than maybe political or government qualities to build up a nation. So spiritual qualities for the nation of Judah, spiritual qualities for the people of God, looking back and how God is giving them hope. God is giving them restoration. So the main themes of the Chronicles can be summed up in two R words. Those are repentance and restoration. Repentance and restoration. And there is a famous verse in Second Chronicles that I'm sure you have heard before that talks about repentance and restoration. It's Second Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14. Let me read them to you. It says this: "If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land." So see the perspective, the difference of Kings and Chronicles, focusing on repentance, restoration, and hope in God. We'll be reading Chronicles for the next 6 days. So I want to encourage you and see you soon.